My mother called me too much in front of 23 people on Sunday, March 9th. We were gathered around my parents' long oak dining table in Upper Arlington, just outside Columbus. The good china was out, the roast was already cooling. My brother Evan was at the head of the table beside my father, laughing about a vendor issue at his restaurant like it was a charming inconvenience instead of a warning sign. I had asked one question: are you sure refinancing the Riverside property is the safest move right now? It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't accusatory, it was the kind of question I ask for a living. I'm 32 years old and I work as a compliance analyst for a regional bank in Columbus. Risk assessment is what I do. I look for patterns before they become problems. But my mother set her fork down with a sharp click against porcelain and looked at me like I had insulted her personally. "Claire, you are always too much for this family," she said. "Too opinionated, too intense. Not everything has to be a crisis." The room went still. My father, Thomas Bennett, 63, owner of 4 rental properties, and a man who prides himself on being steady, didn't correct her. He folded his napkin and added almost casually, "You make everything harder than it needs to be." Across from me, Evan smirked into his wine glass. He's 36, charismatic, running a restaurant downtown that's been about to turn the corner for 3 years. "You don't have to audit dinner, Claire," he said. "Relax." I felt 22 eyes shift toward me. My aunts, 2 cousins, Uncle Ray from Cincinnati, even my grandmother's old friend who still comes to these dinners out of habit. No one said anything. No one defended me. For a long time I would have. I would have explained that refinancing a rental property to cover restaurant debt carries risk, that interest rates aren't a suggestion, that guarantees have consequences. I would have pulled up numbers on my phone, walked them through scenarios, tried to prove I wasn't attacking them, I was protecting them. That night, I didn't. I folded my hands in my lap and nodded like a reasonable daughter. "Okay," I said quietly. "Too much." The words didn't sting the way they used to. They settled somewhere deeper, heavier. Not anger, not even humiliation, something closer to clarity. I noticed for the first time the cream-colored legal folder in my bag by the entryway. I had brought it without really thinking copies of documents I'd skimmed earlier that week. Something about the refinancing paperwork had felt off, but I told myself it was probably a clerical error. My mother reached for the gravy boat conversation, resuming around her like nothing had happened. I watched my father refill Evan's glass, and I stopped defending myself. 2 weeks later, at my grandfather Walter Bennett's 76th birthday dinner in Dayton, he would ask to see the signed papers, and no one at that table, not even me, was prepared for what would be read out loud. That night in Upper Arlington, though, I just sat there, labeled and silent, while the people who raised me decided who I was. Too much. For the first time in my life, I didn't argue. I paid attention. Exit hook. I decided that if they thought I was too much for asking questions, I would let the documents answer instead. The next morning was Monday, March 10th, and the bank was open like always. I arrived at my office downtown just before 8. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner, the quiet hum of printers already filling the compliance department. I've worked here for 7 years, long enough to know that patterns rarely announce themselves. They repeat quietly until someone bothers to notice. By 10:30, I had flagged 2 minor reporting inconsistencies in a commercial lending file. Nothing dramatic, just small misalignments that left unchecked could turn into something larger. I documented them, sent the appropriate internal memo, and moved on. That's what I've always done. Growing up in the Bennett household, I was the practical one. Evan was the dreamer. He could walk into a room and make people laugh within 30 seconds. I was the one who noticed when the numbers didn't add up. When Dad bought his first rental property in Hilliard, I was 16 and sat at the kitchen table helping him organize receipts into labeled envelopes. Not because anyone asked me to, because it made sense. Mom used to call me her little accountant. She meant it as a compliment. Somewhere along the way, it became something else. When Evan opened his restaurant at 33, our parents dipped into their savings to help with startup costs. I understood that. Restaurants are risky, but they're also dreams. A year later, when vendor payments started slipping, Dad mentioned cash flow issues over Sunday pot roast like it was weather. I built him a spreadsheet, No one told me to, I just did it. I categorized supplier invoices, projected seasonal dips, flagged fixed versus variable expenses. I stayed up until midnight that week adjusting formulas so they could see which months were tight. At dinner the following Sunday, Dad patted my shoulder. See, this is why we don't worry about Claire. She can handle anything. It sounded like pride. It felt like assignment. Over time, I became the quiet backstop. I reviewed lease agreements for the rental properties when tenants fell behind. I explained late fees to confused renters. I once co-signed a short-term equipment loan for Evan's kitchen upgrade because his credit utilization was too high at the time. It was supposed to be temporary. Families help each other, Mom had said then. You're strong enough to support him for a few months. I never questioned that logic. Strength in our house meant absorbing impact without complaint. Around noon on March 10th, my phone buzzed with a missed call notification from an unfamiliar number. I stepped into the hallway and listened to the voicemail. Hi, this is Martin from Mid-Ohio Produce. We're following up on invoice 1847. We have your number listed as secondary contact regarding the Bennett Hospitality account. Secondary contact. I stared at the phone for a moment. It wasn't the first time a vendor had reached out to me by mistake, or maybe not by mistake. In the past, I would have called Dad, immediately smoothed things over, reassured the supplier, protected Evan's reputation. Instead, I saved the voicemail. Back at my desk, I opened my calendar. 2 weeks from now, Grandpa Walter's 76th birthday dinner in Dayton, Sunday evening. Grandpa Walter Bennett, my father's father, retired CPA 76 and still sharper than most analysts half his age. He'd always watched our family dynamics with an expression that gave nothing away. The cream-colored legal folder from the night before was sitting on the passenger seat of my car. I had meant to drop it off at home before work, but forgot. Inside were copies of refinancing documents I'd skimmed late Saturday night. I told myself again it was probably nothing, a clerical overlap, a misfiled form. Patterns rarely announce themselves, they repeat. And for the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to fix anything. I was noticing. Exit hook. That evening, I pulled the folder from my car and decided to look at the dates more carefully. Tuesday, March 11th. I left work a little after 5 and drove straight home instead of stopping at the gym like I usually did. The cream-colored folder was still on the passenger seat, quiet and patient. I carried it inside, set it on my kitchen table, and stood there for a moment staring at it like it might explain itself. My condo in Grandview Heights is small but orderly, 2 bedrooms, neutral walls, everything in its place. I've always liked that about living alone. There's no confusion about what belongs to whom. I washed my hands, poured a glass of water, and sat down. Inside the folder were copies of the refinancing documents for the Riverside property, one of my parents' 4 rental units. I had accessed the preliminary filings online late Saturday night through the Franklin County Public Records portal. At the time, I told myself I was just double-checking numbers. Now I wasn't so sure. I laid the pages out in order: loan estimate, disclosure forms, guarantor, acknowledgement, signature page. There it was, secondary guarantor, Claire Elisabeth Bennett, my full legal name, typed cleanly beneath the primary borrower, Thomas Bennett. I leaned back in my chair and read it again, slower this time. The document stated that the guarantor acknowledged joint responsibility in the event of default. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't symbolic support. It was legal liability. My pulse didn't spike. That surprised me. I felt methodical. I flipped to the signature page. There was a signature next to my printed name. It looked like mine at first glance. Similar slope, similar loop in the B, but something about the spacing felt off. Below the signature line was the notary acknowledgement. State of Ohio, County of Franklin, date February 22nd. I stood up so abruptly my chair scraped against the tile. February 22nd was a Saturday. I walked to my hallway calendar where I still keep work travel marked in blue ink. I don't rely on memory for things that can be verified. February 22nd, Chicago, Midwest Regional Compliance Conference. I had flown out Friday morning and didn't land back in Columbus until Sunday evening. My badge was probably still in the side pocket of my suitcase. I went to the bedroom, pulled the suitcase from the closet, and found it within seconds, plastic badge holder with my name printed beneath the conference logo. Claire Bennett. February 21st to 23rd, Chicago, Illinois. I returned to the kitchen table and looked again at the notary stamp. Franklin County. The notary's commission number was printed clearly. The document stated it had been signed in person. My mind did what it always does when presented with conflicting data. It searched for benign explanations. Power of attorney number 1. I would remember signing one. Electronic signature authorization. But this was notarized in person. Clerical error. Possible. But why was my name listed at all? I picked up my phone and scrolled to my father's contact. For a full 10 seconds, I considered calling him. In the past, I would have opened with reassurance. I'm sure this is nothing, but I just want to clarify. I imagined his expression tightening. My mother's voice in the background. Here we go again. Too much. I set the phone down. Instead, I pulled up the Franklin County Recorder's website and requested certified copies of the full refinance package. If there was a mistake, it could be corrected with documentation. That's how systems work. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't jump to conclusions. But I did take screenshots of the online filing timestamps. I printed the travel confirmation email from the conference. I slid everything back into the cream folder, adding a sticky note to the inside cover, verify dates. The first real clue wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confession or a confrontation. It was a date. And dates, unlike feelings, don't shift to fit the room. Exit hook. On Wednesday, I decided I would ask my parents about it carefully, calmly, and see what explanation they offered. Wednesday, March 12th. I drove to my parents' house after work with the cream folder on the passenger seat and a script in my head. I told myself I would keep it simple. Ask about the refinance, clarify the guarantor line, give them room to explain. Upper Arlington looked the same as it always did, trimmed lawns, porch lights glowing warm against early spring dusk. My parents' house, the Riverside property, was one of the ones tied to the refinancing. I parked along the curb instead of the driveway, a small choice. It felt intentional. Mom opened the door before I knocked twice. Claire, she said, surprised but guarded. We weren't expecting you. Dad was in the living room watching the news, the volume low. Evan wasn't there. I didn't sit. I didn't reach for the folder. I just wanted to ask about the Riverside refinance, I said evenly. There's a document listing me as secondary guarantor. Dad muted the television. That's what this is about, he asked, exhaling sharply. Claire, it's paperwork. Don't start. I'm not starting anything I said. I just need to understand. Mom crossed her arms. You always assume the worst. The conversation didn't escalate. It thinned. Dad explained vaguely that the lender required additional names during restructuring, that it was temporary, that sometimes documents list family members for continuity. It's not a big deal, he repeated. You don't need to dissect every line. I asked about the February 22nd signing date. Dad frowned. You're overthinking it, Mom added. We're trying to support your brother. You could at least trust us. There it was again. Trust in our house meant compliance. I didn't accuse, I didn't mention Chicago, I didn't show them the notary stamp. I nodded like I had on Sunday and said, okay. When I left, the folder was still unopened. The next morning, Thursday, March 13th, I removed myself from the Bennett family group chat. No announcement, no speech, just silence. By Saturday, Mom texted separately, Are you upset about dinner? You've been distant. I didn't respond immediately. On Monday, March 17th, I declined the usual Sunday invitation before it was even formally sent. Busy this week, I wrote. It was the first Sunday dinner I had skipped in years. The shift was subtle, but it rippled. On Tuesday afternoon at work, my phone buzzed again. Another vendor, different name. Hi, this is Laura from Capital Equipment Leasing. We're trying to confirm payment arrangements for Bennett Hospitality. We were told you're a guarantor contact. Guarantor contact. I stepped into the stairwell, this time away from the open office. I'm not authorized to discuss that account, I said carefully. There was a pause on the other end. Oh, that's not what we were told. After I hung up, I stood there for a moment staring at the concrete wall. In the past, I would have called Dad immediately. I would have fixed it before it became awkward. I would have protected everyone from embarrassment. Instead, I opened the Notes app on my phone and logged the call. Date, time, company name. That evening, Mom left a voicemail. "Your father feels like you're punishing us," she said. "All this distance over paperwork, Claire, you're making this harder than it has to be. Harder. Too much." The narrative was already forming. I wasn't accusing them. I wasn't confronting them. I was simply stepping back. And that apparently was more threatening than any argument I could have made. 2 weeks from now, at Grandpa Walter's 76th birthday dinner in Dayton, everyone would be in the same room. For now, though, the pressure wasn't loud. It was quiet. And it was building. Exit hook. When the formal invitation to Grandpa's birthday arrived in the mail that Friday, I realized the timing might not be accidental. Sunday, March 23rd. I drove to Dayton with the cream-colored folder on the seat beside me and a decision I could no longer undo. Grandpa Walter's house sits on a quiet street lined with older maples, the kind that arch over the road like they've been protecting it for decades. He's lived there since before I was born. A retired CPA, 76 years old, precise in his habits and generous with his time, he has always believed that numbers tell the truth long before people are ready to. By the time I pulled into the driveway, cars were already lining both sides of the street. My aunts, uncles, cousins, nearly everyone was there. The air carried that familiar mix of roast chicken coffee and lemon furniture polish. I paused in the car and touched the folder. For 2 weeks I had replayed every possibility. I could keep this quiet. I could confront my parents privately again and accept whatever explanation they offered. I could withdraw completely and protect only myself. Or I could stop protecting everyone else from the consequences of their own choices. Inside the house was loud with overlapping conversations. Aunt Margaret spotted me first. She lives in Cincinnati and works as an attorney specializing in estate planning. Practical, sharp, rarely sentimental. She hugged me and held on a second longer than usual. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "I'm fine," I said. Across the room, Mom and Dad stood near the fireplace greeting relatives. Evan was animated, telling a story that had a small cluster of cousins laughing. When Mom saw me, her smile shifted polite tight. "You made it," she said. "I wasn't sure. I said I would," I replied. No one mentioned the refinance. No one mentioned the missed dinners. The silence between us had thickened, but it hadn't broken. Grandpa emerged from the hallway wearing his navy blazer and the same silver watch he's worn for as long as I can remember. His eyes met mine and lingered for half a second longer than casual. "Claire," he said, drawing me into a brief hug, "I'm glad you're here." There was weight in it. We gathered in the dining room as dinner was served. 40 years of family tradition filled that space, birthdays, anniversaries, arguments softened by pie. Tonight felt different. Not tense exactly, charged. Halfway through the meal, I noticed Aunt Margaret speaking quietly with Grandpa near the sideboard. She glanced at me, then at the cream folder resting beside my chair. I hadn't meant for it to be visible. Dad caught the glance too. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After dessert plates were cleared, Grandpa stood and tapped his fork gently against his water glass. "Before we move on to cake," he said, his voice steady but carrying easily across the room, "there's something I'd like to address." The room quieted. Mom shifted in her seat. Evan leaned back, arms crossed. Dad's eyes moved to me. My heart didn't race. It settled. 2 weeks ago, being called too much felt like an accusation. Tonight, it felt like permission. Grandpa looked directly at my father. "Thomas," he said calmly, "I have a question about the Riverside refinance." The cream-colored folder was already in my hands. Exit hook. When Grandpa asked who had signed as secondary guarantor, I knew the silence in that room was about to change forever. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Thomas," he repeated, still standing at the head of the dining table on Sunday, March 23rd, "who signed as secondary guarantor on the Riverside refinance?" It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of question that assumes an answer exists. My father shifted in his chair. "Dad, this isn't really the time," he said, offering a small, controlled smile to the room. We can talk about business later. This is family business, Grandpa replied evenly. And since it involves family liability, I think now is appropriate. The word liability settled over the table like a weight. My mother's hand tightened around her napkin. Evan straightened his easy posture, evaporating. It's standard paperwork, Dad said. The lender required additional names during restructuring. It's temporary. Grandpa nodded once as if acknowledging a data point, and the additional name Dad's eyes flicked toward me for half a second. Claire, he said. For continuity, I felt the cream folder steady in my hands. Grandpa's gaze moved to me. Claire, were you aware of this? Every head at the table turned. 2 weeks ago, I would have rushed to soften the moment. I would have framed it as confusion. I would have protected my parents from embarrassment. I was not, I said calmly. Silence. Mom leaned forward. She knew we were restructuring, she said quickly. We discussed helping Evan. This is being blown out of proportion. I didn't say anything about proportion, Grandpa replied. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and withdrew a set of neatly clipped papers. His copy. I requested the refinance filings on Friday, he said. Public record. I like to review anything tied to family assets. Aunt Margaret, still seated to his right, watched quietly. As an estate planning attorney, she didn't interrupt, but her posture shifted, alert, professional. Grandpa adjusted his glasses. The document lists Claire Elisabeth Bennett as secondary guarantor, he read. Signed and notarized in Franklin County on February 22nd. Dad's jaw tightened. It was handled. Grandpa looked up. Handled how? It's paperwork, Dad repeated. We didn't think it would be an issue. An issue? My voice surprised even me when I spoke next. I was in Chicago on February 22nd, I said, at the Midwest Regional Compliance Conference. Evan let out a short breath, almost a laugh. You travel all the time. Maybe you signed electronically. It's notarized in person, I replied. The room shifted. Mom's eyes darted to Dad. Thomas? He exhaled sharply. Claire, you're making this dramatic. We intended to remove your name once the restructure settled, but it wasn't removed, Grandpa said. No anger, just fact. Dad's defensiveness sharpened. Are you accusing me of something? No, Grandpa said. I'm asking a question. There it was again, one question at a time, the way he had always approached numbers audits discrepancies. I opened the cream folder and placed my printed travel confirmation and conference badge copy on the table beside his documents, not as an attack, as alignment. I'm not accusing anyone, I said, but my name appears on a legal guarantor line for a loan tied to over 6 figures in property debt. I need to understand how that happened. My mother's voice softened, pleading now. Claire, we're family. You could have come to us privately. I did, I said quietly. Dad's shoulders squared. This feels like you're trying to humiliate us. I met his eyes. I'm trying to protect my credit and my future. The stakes were no longer abstract. They sat in plain view on polished wood under chandelier light. Grandpa closed his copy slowly. I'm not interested in humiliation, he said. I'm interested in clarity. The room held its breath. Exit hook. Grandpa's next request wasn't about feelings, it was about the notary verification, and that was when the room truly began to turn. The room didn't explode, it tilted. Let's verify the notary acknowledgement, Grandpa said, still standing, his voice steady enough that it forced everyone else to lower theirs. He adjusted his glasses again and read from the document in his hand. State of Ohio, County of Franklin, signed in person before a commissioned notary on February 22nd. He paused and looked directly at my father. In person. Dad's face had gone from defensive to tight. It was handled through the lender's office, he said. Claire must have authorized it electronically. There are hybrid closings all the time now. Aunt Margaret leaned forward slightly. She didn't speak as a niece. She spoke as an attorney. Hybrid closings still require proper acknowledgement, she said evenly. And if a notary certifies in-person appearance, that's a legal declaration. Evan scoffed. Are we really turning Grandpa's birthday into a deposition? No one laughed. Grandpa didn't respond to the tone. He responded to the data. Claire, he said you have documentation showing you were in Chicago that weekend. I slid the conference badge copy and travel confirmation closer to him. He examined the printed itinerary: flight departure Friday morning, return Sunday evening. Conference registration time-stamped February 21st through 23rd. A quiet murmur moved down the table. Mom's voice sharpened. This is humiliating. Claire, why are you doing this publicly? I didn't bring it up, I said. Dad's chair scraped back slightly as he shifted forward. You could have trusted us to fix it. Instead, you're making us look like criminals. The word hung in the air. I hadn't used it. I'm asking for clarity, I said, because if the restaurant defaults or the property goes into distress, my credit is attached to that loan. That won't happen, Evan snapped. You always assume failure. I looked at him. I analyze risk. The distinction mattered to me, even if it didn't to him. Grandpa placed both sets of documents on the table, aligning them carefully. Thomas, he said, his tone calm but unyielding, did Claire sign this document in your presence? Dad hesitated. A second too long. That's not the point, he replied finally. We were restructuring under pressure. The lender needed signatures quickly. We were told it was temporary. Told by whom, Aunt Margaret asked. Dad didn't answer immediately. Mom reached for his arm. We trusted the loan officer. And did Claire authorize you to sign on her behalf? Grandpa asked. The air thinned. No, Dad said quietly, but it wasn't meant to hurt her. Intent. For years, intent had been the shield. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not triumph. Something steadier. A line. You can't use my name as collateral because you believe I'll understand later, I said. That's not how liability works. A cousin at the far end of the table cleared his throat. Uncle Ray folded his arms and looked down at the paperwork with a frown that hadn't been there earlier. The narrative was no longer about me being too much. It was about a signature. Evan pushed back from the table. This is ridiculous, he said. Claire's acting like we forged something. I didn't say that, I replied. But you're implying it? Mom shot back, her composure fraying. Do you have any idea what this could do to your father's reputation? There it was, reputation. For the first time, the stakes felt tangible beyond the dining room. If this escalated, it wouldn't just be family tension. It could involve lenders, records, investigations. My original plan had been simple: clarify privately, correct, quietly move on. That door was closing. Grandpa gathered the papers into a neat stack. This isn't about reputation, he said. It's about exposure. He looked at me. You need to protect yourself properly. It wasn't permission. It was instruction. Exit hook. That night, driving back to Columbus, I realized protecting myself might mean doing something my family would never forgive. Monday, March 24th. I didn't go into the office until 9. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a full 5 minutes before turning off the engine. The night before driving back from Dayton, I had replayed every sentence: my father's hesitation, my mother's plea, Evan's accusation, the word reputation echoing louder than liability. I had walked into that dinner hoping for clarification. I had walked out with something else entirely. Inside my condo, the cream-colored folder had stayed on the kitchen table. I hadn't tucked it away. I hadn't hidden it. That felt symbolic. By 8:30 that morning, I was at my desk reviewing internal compliance policy, not for my employer's sake, but to steady my own thinking. Systems, process, documentation. When something is misrepresented on a legally binding form, there are procedures. At 9:15, I stepped into an empty conference room and called the lender listed on the refinance paperwork. Good morning, this is Daniel Ortiz with First Central Lending, the voice answered. My pulse stayed level. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm calling regarding the Riverside property refinance executed February 22nd. I appear as secondary guarantor. I need to formally dispute that designation. There was a pause. Do you believe the signature is unauthorized? He asked carefully. I believe I did not sign that document in person as indicated, I replied. And I have documentation proving I was out of state on that date. The shift on the other end was subtle but real. Understood, he said. We'll need a written statement and supporting documentation. Once submitted, we are obligated to open a review. Obligated. That was the word that mattered. I thanked him and ended the call. For a moment, I just stood there looking at my reflection in the dark glass of the conference room window. This wasn't revenge. This was risk containment. At my desk, I drafted the statement. Factual, no adjectives. I attached copies of the travel itinerary, conference badge, confirmation screenshots of the public filing timestamps. I requested written confirmation of receipt. Before sending it, I hesitated. Once submitted, the lender would notify the primary borrower, my father. The fallout wouldn't be private anymore. It would be procedural. I pressed send. At 11:40, my phone lit up with Dad's name. I let it ring once, twice, then I answered. "What did you do?" he demanded without greeting. I submitted a formal dispute regarding the guarantor designation. I said evenly. "You've triggered a review," he snapped. "They've frozen the refinance. Do you have any idea what that does to us?" "To us?" I repeated quietly. "To the property, to Evan's restructuring plan, to everything." I closed my eyes briefly. "This wasn't meant to hurt you," he said, echoing the phrase from the night before. "You could have trusted me. I trusted you," I replied. "That's why my name being there matters." Silence stretched between us. "You're overreacting," he said finally. "No," I answered. "I'm documenting." After we hung up, my hands trembled not from fear, but from the magnitude of what had started. By 2 o'clock, an email from First Central confirmed receipt of my dispute and informed all listed parties that the guarantor status was under formal review. Under formal review. The system had engaged. There would be questions, there would be timelines, there would be records examined by people who did not attend Sunday dinner and did not care about family narratives. For the first time since this began, the chaos felt structured. Not resolved, but contained. Exit hook. By the end of the week, my parents would understand that this wasn't a family disagreement anymore. It was a documented liability. By Thursday, March 27th, the review was no longer abstract. At 10:12 a.m., I received a certified email from First Central Lending requesting additional clarification. Attached was a formal notice sent to all borrowers and guarantors. The February 22nd refinance was under compliance investigation due to a disputed acknowledgement. Compliance investigation, not a family misunderstanding, not a clerical hiccup. An investigation. At 11:03, my phone rang. "Evan," I let it ring once before answering. "What did you tell them?" he demanded. "The truth," I said. "You've triggered a fraud review," he snapped. "They're questioning the notary seal. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand documentation," I replied. "They've suspended the restructuring," he continued. "The bridge financing is contingent on clean title. If this collapses, we lose the expansion deal." The expansion deal. For the first time, the financial stakes were clear beyond sentiment. "That's unfortunate," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But my name cannot remain attached to a document I didn't execute." "You could have withdrawn quietly," he shot back. "Instead, you escalated. I formalized. There was a difference." By early afternoon, Aunt Margaret called. "They've requested the original notarized packet," she said. "If the acknowledgement is inaccurate, the notary could face sanction." "Your father is panicking." I leaned back in my chair. "I didn't request sanctions," I said. "You requested accuracy," she replied. "Sometimes accuracy has consequences." At 3:40 p.m., Dad called. This time his voice wasn't angry. It was tight. "They're asking who was present at signing," he said. "If this gets flagged formally, it becomes public record." "That was always a possibility," I answered. "You're risking everything we built." The phrasing struck me. Everything we built, not everything I risked. "They're asking for affidavits," he continued. "If I state that you authorized remotely, did I asked. Silence. Then lower, "No." Then "Don't state that." The line went quiet except for his breathing. "You're making this bigger than it needed to be," he said finally, though the conviction was thinner now. "It was already big," I replied. "I just didn't know." That evening, an email circulated among all listed parties pending review outcome. The guarantor designation would be temporarily suspended. However, the lender reserved the right to escalate findings to regulatory authorities if discrepancies remained unresolved. Regulatory authorities. The system had moved beyond pause. It had teeth. By Friday morning, March 28th, the local title office had contacted all signatories requesting verification interviews. Evan texted, "This is spiraling." It wasn't spiraling. It was proceeding. At 2:15 p.m., Aunt Margaret forwarded me a copy of the notary log obtained through preliminary inquiry. The entry for February 22nd listed my name, signature time 3:42 p.m., Dayton, Ohio. At 3:42 p.m., I had been seated in a ballroom in Chicago listening to a keynote on regulatory compliance. The irony was almost surgical. That night, my mother left a voicemail. "You've humiliated us," she said, her voice trembling. "People are asking questions. Thomas hasn't slept." I listened once, then I saved it, not out of spite, out of record. By Saturday morning, word had reached extended family. Uncle Ray called to say the restaurant's vendor credit line had been temporarily frozen pending clarification. "Tom should have never put your name on that," he muttered. Shouldn't have. Not couldn't. Shouldn't have. For years I had been told I was too much, too precise, too cautious, too insistent on documentation. Now documentation was the only language anyone respected. By Sunday evening, March 30th, the lender issued a formal update unless valid proof of in-person execution could be provided within 7 business days. The guarantor portion of the refinance would be voided and referred for further review. 7 business days. A clock had started. For the first time since that Sunday dinner, I didn't feel ambushed. I felt aligned. Exit hook. When the deadline hit, the fallout wouldn't just affect a loan. It would redefine my place in this family permanently. 7 business days ended on Tuesday, April 8th. At 9:02 a.m., I received the email. Subject line determination, guarantor, dispute review. I didn't open it immediately. I set my coffee down, straightened the cream-colored folder that had been living on my kitchen counter for 2 weeks, and then clicked. After review of submitted documentation and verification of travel records, the lender had determined that the guarantor acknowledgement dated February 22nd could not be substantiated as executed in person. The guarantor designation was formally voided. The file would be referred to the title insurer for further internal review regarding the notarial discrepancy. My name was removed, legally, officially, in writing. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. There was no surge of triumph, no dramatic rush, just a quiet recalibration inside my chest. At 10:14 a.m., Dad called. I answered. "They voided it," he said. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. "I know. They're escalating the notary issue," he added. "We've retained counsel." That was the first time he used that word. Counsel. Not family, not misunderstanding. Counsel. I didn't request that, I said. "No," he replied. "You requested accuracy." Silence lingered. "The expansion deal fell through," he continued. "The bridge lender withdrew pending clean title confirmation. I absorbed that without reacting." "That wasn't my objective," I said. "I know," he answered quietly. The shift was subtle but real. Not admission, not apology, but recognition. "You could have called me first," he added, though the edge was gone. "I did," I said, "in that dining room." He exhaled. "I never thought of you as too much," he said almost to himself. "I thought of you as capable." Capable had always been the compliment that cost me the most. "I'm still capable," I replied, "but I'm not collateral." Another silence, then understood. We ended the call without resolution, but also without denial. Later that afternoon, Aunt Margaret texted that the guarantor removal had been formally recorded. Uncle Ray confirmed the restaurant would have to restructure privately or downsize. No more expansion, no more leveraged optimism built on someone else's name. Consequences, not catastrophic, but real. That evening, I carried the cream-colored folder to my desk. I didn't shred it. I didn't archive it in some hidden drawer. I placed it in a labeled file box, personal legal. It wasn't a weapon. It was a boundary. Sunday, April 13th, I drove to Dayton again, this time not for confrontation. Grandpa was in the garden when I arrived. He looked up, squinting in the sunlight. "Resolved?" he asked. "Resolved," I said. He nodded once. "Good. Justice doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it just looks documented." We sat on the back patio with iced tea. No speeches, no strategy sessions, just quiet. For years I had been told I was too opinionated, too precise, too hard to handle. What I was, it turned out, was unwilling to sign my future away without reading the fine print. And that wasn't too much. That was self-respect. I didn't know what would happen next with my parents, whether accountability would become reflection, whether distance would become repair. But I knew this: my name would only appear on documents I personally signed. My voice would not shrink to keep someone else comfortable, and my boundaries were no longer negotiable. If you've ever been told you were too much simply for protecting yourself, I'd love to hear your story. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story resonated, consider liking or following along. There's another story waiting that might feel just as close to home.